So, hot take. Economic freedom is for retirees, if they're lucky, and professors, if they're lucky, if they get tenure or something like that. So they're the parts of our society who can work on the things that they want to work on, hobbies that they want to work on, projects, businesses, ideas that they want to work on without having to worry about where their next meal is coming from, assuming again that they had a retirement plan or that they have tenure. And this brings us to today's topic, which is UBI, Universal Basic Income. For someone who doesn't know about Universal Basic Income, what would be your like elevator pitch? If you were like pitching this to the government, you just like walked into the elevator and boom, there's all Cyril in there. You're like, oh, Cyril, and then you're like, oh, boy, do I have an idea for you.
Well, so uh, the fact of the matter is that there actually already is something akin to that. So if people have been aware of the news lately, there has been a recent kind of green paper, they call it, around a mandatory pension fund in South Africa. Fortunately, it has currently been scrapped thanks to some friends at Dear South Africa, an online site where you can submit your sort of feedback to these kind of government decisions. But basically, the idea is within that act that there was a certain part where it's going towards things like universal basic income, where effectively you would distribute a fixed amount to basically everyone within a country, or I would say anyone within a certain jurisdiction. And the idea being that rather than having to spend money on focusing on different aspects of, poverty and those kind of things, that it would be easier to just distribute it and let market forces take the correct actions to help those people out.
Right. So I think what an interesting distinction over there is that when UBI is bandied about, people tend to lump it in as a socialist solution to a capitalist created problem, but it's neither socialist nor capitalist really. It's kind of post-capitalism. Is there are a bunch of problems that capitalism has that it is ill-equipped to solve because not everything that we do in our lives has a market value. So by guaranteeing an income for everyone, regardless of social or financial status or incentives, to cover their basic needs, so that's like housing, clothing, and food. In South Africa, I'm going to spitball an amount and say like 8,000 rand per month would cover that, maybe less. And the reason for it not being dependent on social or like financial status is that you don't want a point where people are disincentivized from actually going and working and then losing access to their UBI, which has been one of the big problems with welfare.
Yeah. So one of the challenges with UBI is, first of all, is there's the model of you're giving out money to a certain population, and there's questions around whether you can do effective targeting. So in most of the UBI studies, they kind of focus on a certain group, and it's usually the people who need that money the most. And I'm talking more in terms of developed or developing societies, because you know to people who watch like news in the US, UBI means a different thing there, because to a certain degree, it's a first world country. There are certain things taken care of. And when you go and look to things like Africa, there is a more dire situation in terms of poverty.
Yeah. So I like to think of a UBI as kind of being like seed money for everyone, right? And I know that like being paid for being alive sounds pretty outrageous, but even in South Africa, and we'll talk about South Africa during this episode because it's the economy that we're the most familiar with. But this can be applied to many other developing countries and also developed countries to a certain extent. But we have enough capital, and by capital I don't actually mean money. I mean access to buildings and resources for construction and stuff to shelter and clothe everyone. Now, with UBI, because it's going to be going to the entire population, there'll have to be a bunch of regulations in place around that to make sure that it's not
Hmm.
exploited. And I'd say that the one that really jumps to mind for me is just like not allowing people to take out loans on their UBI. Like if your UBI doesn't count as your income, therefore you are not credit worthy until you have an income, and your credit is only applied to your post UBI income. I'd say let's before we get into the potential downsides of UBI.
So the first thing is also that it has to have a source, right? So with any kind of discussion about money, I always like to think of it in terms of flows of money. So cash is something that I would consider almost like a a liquid. It kind of flows from one place to another. So
Yeah,
you need to have a source, which is someone who is, I would say, economically productive. They already have some form of job, and they would gather, that they would have money coming from that, and obviously that, in maybe the communist sense, is that value that is being created, and for that value that you create by doing some sort of work or by giving your time, that value you're converting into money, and then by taxing that money, it comes into the government, and that money can flow through UBI to those who need it more, to come and get some of these sort of benefits of,
well, technically
uh,
to everyone.
to everyone. I mean, to a certain extent, you would be taxed at a certain rate, and then I think the rate in this specific bill was between 8 and 12% of earnings. So this would be a tax for people who are currently taxpayers.
Yeah.
It would be a tax added to your income tax. So at the moment, you would have income tax. So, you know, at the end of the month, you just get less money. There's also questions about the effect that that would have. So imagine, you're a salary earner, suddenly a switch is turned or the bill is signed, and you get around 10% of your money is now taken away. What effect that has? But then the kind of outcome is that the expectation in this bill is that they wanted to get to a value of around 7,500 Rand per month for basically everyone. And even, in a sense of true universal basic income, meaning like there's no targeting, you would essentially get that back even if you are a salary earner. But whether that's the same as your sort of your 10% that you put in, that's a question that you kind of have to grapple with. And at that point, especially for the middle class, who are predominantly the taxpayers, they would there would be a political problem with that. And as you can see, if you go into some of these people who are, I would say, disputing the bill, a lot of those concerns are around the fact that can we really trust a government to do it effectively when in South Africa we have this big problem of corruption.
So I actually believe, and this is from what I take away from UBI, right? Is that UBI uh, is completely affordable. So in South Africa, we would essentially be redirecting existing budgets from social and welfare programs such as like RDP housing, and because people can now afford to do that, right? And uh, let's talk about just housing for a second. Is that governmental housing projects are extraordinarily complicated, and there are contractors involved, and there's so many holes in that bucket where money can just be lost through corruption, etc., etc. Whereas UBI is very simple, right? It's capital, and then that capital gets distributed to all citizens of the country. So there's actually a lot less of a chance of that money disappearing than it would have through all these different welfare programs. The second one is that there's a lot more market stimulation from people opening businesses because, and this has also been shown in uh, the small studies that have been conducted is when people are free to work on the things that they want to, there's big entrepreneurial spike. I mean, I would have started my own company a long time ago if I didn't have to work a full-time job to, just make sure that I can eat and live. And a
Mm.
lot of people go back and study. And then there's, the people who want to volunteer, work on the climate problem. There's the growth of like human to human jobs where we actually want humans more, like a barista or like taking care of the elderly. And there are
Mm.
people who are artistic, they're making film projects, they're making art. um, but I think more importantly is that, like, when we talk about, oh, UBI is unaffordable, is I think that that's actually not necessarily correct, because even if you are, let's take for instance, a bum on the UBI system, you just take the money and you only ever spend, but you don't necessarily contribute economically, is at least you're not homeless, and also you are now spending 8,000 rand a month, which
Yeah.
means that you are actually contributing economically. You're going to the coffee shop and you're paying for your coffee. You're injecting that capital back into the system that creates more jobs and
Mm.
stimulates these businesses, et cetera, et cetera. So I so the extra tax revenue that comes from just like VAT for all this extra money that is being like re-stimulated inside of the economy is great.
Mm. And essentially, like when you're doing that purchase, that VAT would go back into a tax incentive. So on the one side, I mean, playing a bit of devil's advocate, if from what I've been reading is that there's this idea of a constraint. So when you're in poverty or in the situation where you would benefit from UBI, there's generally some constraints, and whether it's the access to capital that we talked about, or you need some sort of healthcare, or if you're disabled, you would maybe need some sort of disability assistance. In a kind of technocratic way, you might say, like, well, rather than divert this money in a general sense, can we not take that money and convert it to a specific cause, such as housing or healthcare? And in that sense, we could kind of solve that problem and effectively make it more effective for those people down there. And I mean, you did mention that it does add that element of complication when it comes to, so like a country like South Africa, where there is kind of corruption and there's rubbing points where money exchanges hands.
Yeah, is that one of the things that we have proven time and time again is the efficiency of capitalism in market-based allocation, right? So when it comes to housing, is that governmental housing projects, and you can like look through the records and you will see this time and time again, is governmental housing projects are always behind schedule, they are always over budget, and money just disappears, and it's a leaky bucket. Whereas a bunch of individuals or contractors that are building houses and getting more people participating in that market to rent, because they now have the ability to do so, is actually a much more efficient way of handling specifically housing.
But what is that exchange? It's essentially a government like, again, thinking to the flow of money, the money flows to the person, and then that person flows to a private company. So that is essentially a transfer from public funds to a private company. And then that's where it kind of gets a little bit political, because you're like, well, some fat cat is gonna earn a profit, and then there's profit incentives, but in a good way, because those profit incentives means that they're going to build houses based on the market, that what people want. Although maybe in housing, I wouldn't say housing, because that's kind of a little bit tricky, because you build a house once and you kind of can't really replace it out.
Yeah, no, I hear you. I hear you. And I do think that it will be a hurdle to overcome. But I do think that, UBI coupled with technological deflation, which is just like the cost of things and stuff is falling because of our improvements in, processes for manufacturing, as well as like the zero marginal cost of information. So theoretically, education has zero marginal cost. If you have a YouTube course, some other person watching that YouTube course doesn't cost YouTube any more money, right? So there is technological deflation, and then a way for people to just survive, which I think when we talk about like the purpose of government, people tend to misconstrue what the government's job is. They think that the government's job is the same as what a business's job is. But a government's job is to try and improve the quality of life and the welfare of the people living
Well,
inside of that state, and protect their interests,
theoretically.
right? Theoretically, right. And the one of the ways that they can protect those interests is by making sure that there is a good economy, because we've seen the better the economy, theoretically, the better quality of life, although that's kind of debatable once you get past a certain point, right?
Mm,
So I think that that's actually just a really good way for the government to redistribute funds to keep money moving, right? Is that they
mm,
were going to go to private institutions anyway. But instead of going directly to private institutions, now they're going to the government via taxation or other methods, and then it's being
mm,
redistributed to everyone. And here's one of the things that I think about when I think about UBI, right? I love Cape Town. I know that you love Cape Town too, right? It is a beautiful, beautiful city on the southern tip of Africa. I just watched the most gorgeous sunset before hopping on this podcast, and the only real issues that I have with the city are crime and homelessness, right? And these are crimes of desperation. These are people coming and like stealing your cell phone so that they can sell it, and buy, uh, whether it be drugs or whether it be food or something, is like they need that, right?
mm,
And so for me, UBI is kind of like the way that we remove that desperation from society. And because that desperation has been removed, I mean, we've talked about this in
mm,
previous podcast episodes. If we can solve the problem of desperation inside of Cape Town will thrive as a remote working hub. It will thrive as a tourism hotspot, and will have all of this foreign capital injected into the economy right here, which means that we'll have like Germans coming and sitting at coffee shops and sipping on, 35 Rand cappuccinos. And there's going to be a barista behind the counter. It's going to be Moses, right? Moses is going to be behind the counter, like doing his thing, making coffee, enjoying
yeah,
himself, because that's his art, right? He doesn't have to be there, and he doesn't necessarily resent the fact that he's there. He's there because this is his art, and he loves making coffee for people. And also, it changes his life from, or it changes everyone's lives from surviving, right? So the reason to work as a person who's on UBI is that you're just surviving if you've got 8,000 rand a month, but you can thrive by working on top of that.
yeah, exactly. So on the part of crime. So from the reading I did, it was very brief. It does seem that it does decrease. There are a few studies that show that it does decrease the number of offendings. So basically, people who commit crimes. So that is one aspect to it. The other one being there is most of the things that I've read is actually it's actually a psychological effect. So by giving someone sort of a sort of UBI, you are giving them a kind of sense of hope. Because when you're living on like $1 or $2 or one or two, you're living on scraps, you kind of lose this even the ability to imagine that you could get to that point. So when you're so like downtrodden, sometimes it's like you don't even want to bother like trying to start a
Mm,
business. When you're struggling to make means ends. But from a lot of the studies that I was looking through, it does have a good psychological effect, and that can lead to things like better health. So being able to, instead of buying a McDonald's because that's like what's there, and you're using your money that you've collected out of the car guard to go and buy yourself something dodgy, you can
right.
have some more positive effects on a psychological level, and that'll eventually lead to having more optimism and more. I mean, there's kind of questions around whether it leads to more risk taking ability. So it might, but it also might mean that you might just save that money.
Yeah, I mean, you don't necessarily have to, like, you should still save, right? But it's not a imperative to save, because you know that like if things hit rock bottom, right, your business venture collapses and your girlfriend kicks you out and your parents disown you, is you'll still be able to rent an apartment, you'll still be able to eat food, and you'll still be able to look for a job. And I think that another thing that is important to talk about in terms of that context is that a country with UBI would have less exploitation in jobs because it isn't a necessity, right? The person who is being mistreated at work and working way too hard and not being paid enough, if they have a base to like a basic income, they could just leave. The second one is that the concept of a minimum wage would disappear, because a minimum wage is just one of our ways of trying to reduce exploitation. But in a case where you don't have to work, means that exploitation isn't a problem in that context, and we could, not care about minimum wage. I mean, like, let's take for instance, you really like dogs, right?
Mm.
And someone's like, hey Jason, uh, can you watch my dogs all of Saturday for 50 rand, right? Technically, they are breaking minimum wage laws, right? They are offering you less than
Mm.
minimum wage to do something. But now you were just planning to sit at home and watch YouTube videos for the entire day anyway. So,
But I could come do it on your couch and
yeah, exactly.
and look at your dogs, and I get a little bit extra.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that what you said about it being a psychological improvement to the people who are on it is definitely true. Uh,
Mm.
One of the objections to that, though, is especially in South Africa, there are quite a few people who are quite critical of like homeless people or underprivileged people in the country. And if you suggest giving 8,000 rand a month to
Mm.
people in South Africa, they'd be like, "Oh no, they're just going to go and spend it on drugs and alcohol."
It's a political thing.
It's a bit of a political thing, and like keep in mind that I could definitely see a populist a political candidate run on the platform of we should not have UBI, or we should drop UBI because people are buying drugs and alcohol with it, while sidestepping everything that is good about it, right? Because people don't like the idea that their tax money is being used by someone to go and take drugs. The fact of the matter is that we have seen in these small studies in Canada and Finland that communities that started receiving a UBI, there was actually a decrease in drug and alcohol abuse because of what you said. Like, people felt like they had a better chance of succeeding. A lot of drugs and alcohol abuse happens because people feel that they can't get out. Like, this is where they are, and that's where they're going to stay. Whereas this says like, hey, listen, you can go back to school, you can actually clean up your life. But if you are just going to do drugs, right? At least you're not doing drugs on the street. At least you're doing drugs
Mm.
in your apartment, right? At
Mm.
least you're not begging from people for food. Is you
Mm.
at least have your food. So even if people did spend it on drugs and alcohol, it's still a better situation for them.
100%. And I think it maybe like talks more to having in a sense, it is it's a social security system. So it's a system where if we read all these stories about people living month to month, and then one day they have maybe they couldn't pay their car payment for 1 month, and then they have a car accident, and suddenly they're not insured, or something happens, maybe they get sick, and then they lose that extra month, and suddenly that puts them into debt, and then there's a debt cycle that takes them lower and lower down. So whether that's something that UBI solves, which I mean it might be an easier way of doing it, or whether you have better governance around, or better government policy around the fact that if you default, there's not so much of a penalty. And I mean, in a sense, we do kind of have the whole credit system of credit scores and all of that, which is not necessarily controlled by the government, but it's kind of,
Hmm.
if you do something wrong, you're going to get punished more, and then you won't be able to pull yourself out of that hole. So having that sort of mental catching net of saying like, okay, we can look after you. You're not necessarily going to be living a lush life, but you will be able to survive and get by.
Oh, so specifically with that is, I think it's important to have a whole bunch of economists sit around and calculate what the UBI should be based on what the threshold is for surviving, right? So not so I spitballed the 8,000 rand a month because that's how I understand surviving in Cape Town. But fact of the matter is that you can survive for significantly less than that in this country, and also it because you can live anywhere. Uh, we'd see, I think, a exodus from cities where people have to be in order to do their jobs, which they need to have, where
Mm,
they could go and live in a much more affordable part of the country
mm.
and potentially even stimulate those areas over there.
Yeah, and one of the things that what I'm very optimistic about is the fact that in certain ways the developing world is a little bit ahead of the sort of developed countries, in the fact that in the developed countries they had this idea of a consistent job where everyone had one
Mm.
job and that was taxed in a certain way. But in a developing world, essentially you do have multiple streams of income, and if you look at some of the westernized media, you see that that's becoming a very popular thing. Like you might not necessarily have a solid salary job, but you might be doing things on Fiverr, you might be doing a little piece on the side there in every different place. And also on top of that, you have the fact that you having more access to other forms of equity. So in the way that I think about it, a small sort of trading platform like Easy Equities can give you access to equity in a sense that you're not
Mhm.
essentially having to spend a lot of capital. It's still percentage based. There's no minimums. Not an advertisement anyway, by the way, but essentially you'll have more of those platforms where even if you're earning 100 or even if you're earning like the 8,000 rand that we're talking about, you could still put a portion of that into for instance stocks or fractional home ownership and all of these kind of nice things, and have some form of
Yeah.
equity, although whether that's within your lifetime makes sense, whether someone would forego the opportunity cost of spending that extra, because if you're only saving like a hundred rand a month, or even 1,000 rand a month, it can get you to somewhere. But whether it gets you to somewhere over a lifespan to be able to afford a house one day, that's something that you have to kind of consider when it comes to the opportunity. But it does give you some access to a form of capital.
So I'm sure you can tell from this half hour so far that I'm a bit of a fan of the concept of UBI.
Mm,
I I do have one, maybe two objections to it, but they're very soft objections. And so what you said is definitely true on an economic sense, but from a, I don't want to say an emotional sense, but like a psycho spiritual sense, is that some people are afraid that a UBI will diminish the value of work. So there's this industrial age idea that the purpose of a human is to contribute economically. And I think that we're kind of on the precipice of going into a different age. Actually, I've mentioned this book to you a few times, and I will mention it again. Is The World After Capital is such a good read, and it actually talks about the transition from the industrial age into the knowledge age, and about our like the values that were ingrained into us during the industrial age of like getting our sense of purpose from our jobs and the value of work. And this is something that I've been struggling with in my own life because I essentially have a UBI, or I guess it's not super basic, but it's like I have, a company that I don't necessarily have to do too much work at, and it will give me a salary every month. And I have to figure out what it is I actually want to do with my time. Is that volunteering? Is that spending time on arts and hobbies? Is that getting into good physical shape, spending time with my family and friends and stuff like that? And the answer to those is yes, but in what quantities? How do I figure it out? What is it I'm going to do with my time? And it means that a UBI will kind of be a forced introspection to a bunch of to the population, saying like what is it that you want to spend your time doing? Because uh, this is something Simon has said a few times, where when you're young, it's this idea that like, what do you want to be when you grow up? Like, what is your dream job? And his answer is like, my dream is not labor, right? My dream isn't to be labor.
The way that I phrase it is it's that work is work. So no matter what you're doing, whenever you're working, it's always expending energy. So, I mean, I know because I'm sort of a little bit lazy and maybe potentially a procrastinator. If I had a constant source of income, my worry is that I would just lie flat on a couch and play Xbox all day. Because you can still order some food, you can go have coffee, you can there's almost this idea that you will move towards sloth and be like more lazy, and to a certain extent, a lot of the studies that I was reading through, they do have there is a market drop in the hours worked, but whether that is to focus on things like education, as you said, or to child rearing, there might be a
Mm-hmm.
benefit in a sort of psychological and societal sense. But I mean, in your circumstance and in the circumstance of, you know, someone who's essentially got something to fall back on, you kind of have to think a little bit harder in terms of, what that means for you going forward, and what that means, how you're going to contribute, and whether I mean, if as someone who doesn't really aspire to, things that are kind of material, it comes becomes very hard
Mm-hmm.
because like someone who's more materialistic, they're like, well, I want a car, so they're going to work a little bit harder to maybe afford that, or maybe afford to go on like a nice vacation. But I mean, also having been minimalist and also being very anti-materialistic, I'd say it's very hard to have those things to aspire to.
Yeah, I hear that. Well, one of the things that I will circle back to is we have a problem in the first world that's going to start affecting South Africa soon as well, and that is an elderly population, right? There are going to be more old people than young people, and taking care of elderly has uh, historically been something that people did because it was a thing that they did. It
Mm.
was a part of tradition. It was a part of just what being in a family was. But then when we moved into like full industrialization, you would go and you would work the entire day, and so the elderly went off to homes, right? And they would be in an old age home. But I would see that the growth of people taking care of the elderly again as something that they do. You're on UBI, you can take care of your aging grandfather or your aging parents or something like that, which I think will take strain off of the person's diminished value of work or purposefulness, but also it will take strain off of the government, which needs to essentially take care of old people if they can't take care of themselves.
Yeah, and for a lot of, I mean, maybe for us it's not so much of a problem, but to some of our friends, there is this concept of, black tax, and having to look after those parents, and maybe in the same household. Luckily, like, I'm fortunate enough that my parents are
Mm-hmm.
like, don't you don't have to look after me. But if you're earning a certain salary, and immediately 20 to 30% of that goes to looking after your kids, or looking after your, I mean, kids is a different thing, but looking after your parents, you've kind of got this generational sandwich, as they call it. So I mean, it exacerbates when you do have kids, because then you're basically looking after them and looking after your parents, and you're not able to fulfill your own kind of dreams and goals. So I mean, it can be problematic, but having something look after those your parents as they get older would alleviate that and allow you to have more access to something that you really want to fulfill.
So that definitely, and then also, and I'm just like completely spitballing off the cuff over here,
Mm,
is I do believe that if UBI were a thing, we would see a growth of community centric households where people share expenses more
mm,
and are like form closer communities, because as we know, like sharing a household is one of the most effective ways to save money, and having a multiple income household is really good. So if you've got like an entire family that lives in a house together, that would be economically beneficial for everyone involved over there, and that could lead to stronger social cohesion inside of communities, as well as like better emotional support and like less mental health issues, and also solving the problem of taking care of children and taking care of adults.
yeah, and one of the things that kind of stuck out for me when I was reading up on it is that especially in the developing world, there is a tendency to want to. I mean, in the trials that they did for UBI, there's a tendency to want to group those sort of monthly payments and then have more of a larger tranche that comes out at a certain point. So I mean, it's similar to the idea of a stockpile that we have in South Africa, where members of the community will group that money together and use that sort of collective
Hmm.
money to you know build a school, or send one of your friends to college or university, and there's kind of those kind of social aspects of pooling those amounts of money together. But then again, there's always the devil's advocate of whether it would just be better to have those sort of systems taken care of already and not have to have these kind of I would say layer two kind of solutions.
Yeah, I'd say that, and again, this harkens back to housing and everything, is that we we do know that in a lot of cases, such as allocation, just allocation in general, is the market is really good at allocating. So whether that be food or schools or supermarkets or housing, is we know that that's actually really good if there are people who can participate in the market. And if everyone's got a UBI, everyone can participate in that market.
Mm.
Um, but one thing that uh, there that we don't have a price for, that we can't allocate a market to, is the the looming climate
Mm.
catastrophe. And I think that that's something that more people would be interested in getting involved with, whether it be volunteering in local projects, whether it be like sea cleanup or advocacy groups for not burning down rainforests and stuff like that. Is like, I believe that there are so many people who care about causes that they just can't realistically become involved with, because man's got to eat.
If you are only thinking about that next meal, as you were saying, do you even think about things like extrinsic kind of causes? I mean, thinking back to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, you kind of focus on the first layer of shelter, food, water. Once you get that, and only right at the top is things like self-actualization, where I'd probably, I mean, it's not necessarily a good model, but I'd say that you're more towards a self-actualization stage where you looking to kind of find things more intrinsic in terms of fulfilling your ambitions and goals. So you're looking to do like more altruistic things because you have filled up all of these other needs on the other levels. Luckily, I've never been in that position. So I mean, there's a lot of things that come out of it, and one of the main points that I saw is that in terms of all of these studies that have been done, there's always been a sort of closing point. So they've never really been truly universal in terms of like persistence. So in a certain sense, that can
Hmm.
skew the data, because I mean, especially also because when it comes to funding these kind of initiatives, it also tends to be targeted to a certain group. So you can kind of imagine that you think it's okay, it's a UBI, but there's always this idea in the back of your mind that at some point it might stop. And does that also have an effect on your kind of the way you approach your spending? So I mean, if I was getting a UBI and I realize it's just a trial of like 2 years and then they're going to reevaluate if I deserve it, that might affect my spending. It might affect the way what I do with that money. There's also the thing of, in the case of US stimulus checks, like a lot of people were probably just, spending it on GMC and crypto. It's like, can you really control what happens with it?
It's super interesting, and I would love to see the first country or like the first state somewhere decide to do that, just like to commit to it and give it, the time of day, and then the rest of the world can see what happens to that country or that state, and we can make our judgments based on that.
The proof is also going to be very much in the pudding, because when it comes to developing countries, the problem is the execution is usually missing. So whether you have something that's more targeted towards a certain demographic, or whether you just have it in a general universal sense, there's certain mechanisms that have to be put in place to make sure that people don't game the system. People don't pretend their dead uncle is alive and collect two of them. There's always room for corruption, so it's very much in the execution of it.
Yeah, but I mean that's there for every governmental system. I mean, I'd say that UBI is a better than welfare because there also isn't like an incentive for you to stay unemployed, and there isn't an incentive for you to have more children so that you can gather more checks.
Yeah, but luckily in this country we do have grants for kids. But I think just to wrap
Yeah.
it up, maybe we just have a question. So, as a kind of person in your sort of, I would say, income group, what would you be willing to spend in terms of your tax to contribute to UBI? And what would you expect to earn? Because there's going to be I mean, it's maybe a question for another conversation, but it's going to be somewhere between, you're not happy to have 100% of your money taken, but where does that number lie?
Yeah, I mean that's a very interesting that's a very interesting question, because that's kind of like communal universal basic income. Everyone's entire income gets taken, and then everyone
Yeah.
gets the same salary. University is like tip sharing, but for a country. We'll just leave that for people to think about.
Yeah, we'll have another topic on like communism or something like that. But I think for me, I would probably say, I'd say around 5% is kind of my threshold. Mostly because I have this idea where I want to control my own funds. So I'd rather donate, my own money that I have left over to kind of causes that I believe in. As for the amount that I wish, I mean, we can have a discussion about it another time. But it's probably, as you were saying, around somewhere between around 8 to 10,000 rand. I mean, this is interesting, and I'm sure we can have
Yeah.
it.
So tell me, where are you right now? What are you doing? And
Yeah, so I'm in a
yeah,
small hotel in the middle of Zagreb, Croatia. I'm kind of in transit doing some self isolation before heading over to London. Quite a nice little smallish city, although you'll be happy to know there's lots of plazas, and there's very wide, I'd say, very wide streets, and not wide streets, but wide sidewalks. And yourself?
hi, I'm up in Gordons Bay, looking out over the ocean, or I was, but it's dark outside now. It's beautiful up here,
Mm.
and it's turning into summer, and there's flowers, and I'm happy, and I have a new podcasting mic.
And I'll get one when I get back to the UK, because my
Yeah,
mic is
do it.
very scratchy, and I've even tried to use the one from my cell phone, which has only got one earpiece piece working. But anyway, it's been great chatting.
Yeah. Been good chatting. Have a great
Yeah,
afternoon.
and we'll see you on the next podcast.